Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone around the world. Thank you for joining us today. We have the pleasure of welcome Dr. Geoffrey Banks, a seasoned pharmaceutical entrepreneur and scientist with over 24 years of experience. I'm Hindle-Yang, the CEO at the MSQ Ventures, a New York-based cross-border advisory firm specializing in the life science. Dr. Banks founded Nuventra Pharma Science in 2008, leading it to success until its acquisition by Valuations. He also co-founded the First Order Pharmaceuticals, contribute significantly to the development of innovative therapies. He has guided over 350 companies in clinical pharmacology and drug development. He is also an active member of the EO. Today, he will share how to boosting pharma valuation using strategy, clinical pharmacology, and PK/PD methods. We are pleased to co-host this webinar with Bio Around the World, a platform that aims to streamline cross-border collaboration on global drug development by sharing real-life practical experience to achieve greater harmonization. Please join me in welcome Dr. Geoffrey Banks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Echo, for the introduction. And hello, everyone. As Echo mentioned, I founded Nuventra in 2008. Background is a PhD in biochemistry. I'm not a clinical pharmacologist by training, but I learned, if you will, on the job. Had an opportunity to start Nuventra in 2008 as an individual consultant in the pharmaceutical industry. Saw an interesting paradigm that particular area of need in the industry for clinical pharmacology was unmet, and saw an opportunity to grow my company to over 120 individuals over 13 years prior to the acquisition by Valuations in 2021. In the middle of that, I had an opportunity to purchase an asset from Pharmaceuticals, spun it into a new startup biotech company called First Order Pharmaceuticals. And it was in epilepsy, developed it for a number of years, and then sold it off to another company. Along that whole way, I just had a tremendous amount of exposure to multiple different types of drug strategies and development programs through companies from small startup biotechs through large pharma, the largest in the world. And so just have a lot of insight that I think could be beneficial to companies as they start to continue their discussions with investors or for partnering about how to sort of boost the valuations for their assets. And so happy to talk about that today.
Thank you, Jeff. What we talked about before, actually look at your background. You are a scientist by training, but just look at what you built in the past almost 15 years, and the knowledge just successfully helped over 350 companies. But you also helped yourself, not help yourself. Actually, you are building the company, and then you made the company to acquired by the Valuations. So can you share your journey from the founding Nuventra Pharma and to the acquisition? I think this is a long journey, but
it's a long journey.
How
yes.
can we capture today? Thank you.
Right. Yes, well, it's very much an entrepreneurial business. I started as a single person consultant in 2008, working with another pharmacokineticist in the industry. And I was primarily focused on doing consulting work, billable hours, and saw that there was an opportunity to build the company around that paradigm of the person I was working with, his name is Bill, and myself, in a way that was sort of not available to companies in the industry. So we found a way to help companies from a consulting perspective and in clinical pharmacology, which was unmet in my perspective. So we just continued to build the organization. We created an opportunity for individual consultants in the pharmaceutical industry to join Nuventra. So we gave them the opportunity to join a group, a consulting firm that was a peer-to-peer sort of network for them, have the opportunity to provide them additional work beyond their individual consultancy. And that gave us very senior level consultants that continued to build the firm. I transitioned my leadership from working sort of head down on, consulting work, billable work with the company to a dual role of being the CEO and working on consulting projects. And so moving from the single entrepreneur doing everything to starting to take off some of the hats. I used to do all of the, IT, HR. I used to do everything as everyone would from a small startup company. And eventually transitioning into a CEO that was running a company with multiple different, lines, verticals, if you will, and opportunities to serve the industry and the need for clinical pharmacology. So we built it up over, again, 13 years. I transitioned from, sort of a startup mentality to more of a corporate-minded CEO, and we had opportunities to continue to grow. I took the opportunity at the end of the company's sort of life cycle to move away from the company and go through an acquisition. And we can talk about that as well, but that was a strategic decision at the time.
Yeah. Wow. That's very inspiration. Like from the one person consulting and the peer to peer, and then be like I remember you mentioned there was hundreds of consultant worker in the firm, right? By the end.
It's about 120 staff. And so we had probably 80, 90 consultants, both senior level and junior level. So we made the opportunity for people coming into the industry to work with very senior level people at sort of the twilight of their career. And that created a fantastic dynamic for the industry, or for our company, that was able to then translate into serving the companies that needed our services.
Yeah, I think this is quite different from other entrepreneur in the biotech industry, because this is I think is more like you building the service, and also the very detailed operation, how to put the people together. So was the entrepreneur always in you before this company?
That's a great question. I think there probably were entrepreneurial tendencies within me. I mean, coming out of a PhD, there was always sort of the lab work I used to do was very trial and error. It was a lot of failure. So learning from that, but being able to push through those periods of failure to success, I think really helped me as I started the business. And I never took any investment dollars for NuVenture. It was all self-funded through revenue generated by the consulting. And so it was very much a bootstrapped sort of company that we built over time, and built in all the infrastructure needed to run a corporation versus a single person entrepreneurial company. So yeah, it was a very interesting and exciting company to be able to build and see evolve and grow over those many years.
Yeah, that's definitely is just feel so fulfilled to look at this small baby to be the teenager and be the adult and then
Right,
graduate from college and then kind of like married now.
right.
So how did the acquisition of New Venture by Allison come about? I think that probably is a hard decision. Also, is a long process, because it's kind of like your scientist background, and then you build a company, like an operation was like a new thing to learn, and now you come to another area is the same in the company, is talking to the investor, negotiation, all the teams. How did that come, and what was the process?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for many years, we had been receiving inbound requests for acquisition from various firms, from private equity, from venture. We ignored them. We wanted to stay private. The pandemic hit in 2020, and NuVenture actually did well. It was one of our best years. We were already a virtual consulting firm, but I could see sort of the writing on the wall, and that it was a tenuous period, and there was a lot of uncertainty coming out of the pandemic. Could we continue and maintain operations? And so the opportunity came along from Allucent, and we just started exploring it and looking at what that might look like from an acquisition perspective. It looked like a very seamless fit into their existing structure, and opportunities to continue growing NuVenture within the corporate structure of Allucent. And sort of one thing led to another, and we went through due diligence and an acquisition in May of 2021. It was difficult. We had plans to continue growing and stay private, but the opportunity to start my company NuVenture in 2008, I say, was an opportunity I couldn't pass up. And I think the acquisition in 2021 was a similar opportunity that I couldn't pass up at the time.
Can I say that was the best result you expected when you built the company? Did you expect that day?
I didn't. We were continuing. I enjoyed, running an entrepreneurial company. We didn't have a board of directors. I was the majority shareholder, and so be able to make the decisions was nice, but it was not something we expected. We continued to grow. We thought we would continue to grow. We had the processes to do it, but it was a difficult time, coming out of the pandemic, and the decision to change paths was made.
So you are quite different from the, how do you say, standard entrepreneur, because most of the entrepreneur or founder, actually, that's what I learned from my MBA. First, you need to think about what's your exit strategy and how much you can build, right?
Right.
You can just have such a drive to build it and to benefit, to provide value to your clients.
That's right. That's exactly right. And I think, as we talked about as being part of entrepreneur organization or EO, there's a lot of information out there about how to grow your business and getting bigger and scaling and all that. And I think I learned a lot about maybe perhaps it's better to stay more, to stay smaller and not grow for just growth's sake, and perhaps have an entrepreneurial business that suits the needs of the entrepreneur as well as the business and the lifestyle of the entrepreneur, instead of taking too much from them. And so I think there's a happy medium, a steady state, if you will, for businesses. You don't have to grow and sell. You can always look for opportunities to continue on in a happy place, if you will.
Yeah, that's I think it's just like if you don't follow money, if you just focus on what you can contribute, the money follow you.
Right, right.
Yeah, I think during this journey, probably your role, like even your personal role or your family, right, have been evolved. So could you please share like how your leadership style, like how you, like a personal, like a view to the to the entrepreneur and to building the company have been evolved through this journey?
Yeah, the leadership style really evolved, I think, pretty significantly because, I was a scientist, a PhD by training, and I don't have a business degree. And so I had to learn how to not only, run a business, develop a business, cultivate employees and their careers. And it really comes down to, I think, being part of EO, entrepreneur organization, really almost was like getting an MBA, in my perspective. I had an opportunity to really, tap into a peer network of other CEOs who were like-minded and going through similar struggles to build companies. And I evolved into, trying to build in the right type of culture for people to grow, giving people opportunities, giving back to the next generation to get them into the industry and give them opportunities. And so the leadership style was very much entrepreneurial. It evolved, I think, more towards maybe a corporate-minded CEO towards the end of the company, because we were so focused on getting bigger and growing more. And that comes back to my earlier comment. Maybe that wasn't the right choice to grow bigger and get bigger. Maybe we had a good culture, and that was our steady state, and we could have stayed there. So I think for me, it was a very much of a learning journey about how to lead other people to success, and it was a great opportunity for me professionally.
Wow, I love it. How to lead others to success. And then others follow you.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a great time.
So do you remember the moment, like which year or you decide to say we will go to bigger? Because actually, I think this is brave. How do you say? I'm the entrepreneur. So actually, sometimes my team is, because my team member, I just feel I don't want to let them down. I want them to feel proud to be here. So I just feel I need to keep make the company better and bigger. So what was your drive to make the company bigger? What was the moment?
Yeah, there was a very specific moment. It was 2018. It was our 10-year anniversary. I took the entire company to Disney World. And yeah, took them to Disney World. I
With the
spoke
kids?
for, right, with kids, families, everything. It was great. I spoke for an hour about the next 10 years and how we were going to get there, implementing a new system that we had sort of come in to know, which was called EOS, or Entrepreneurial Operating System. And so we laid out a large goal of getting to 100 million in revenue by the end of 2028. And that was the strategy to continue to grow. And so that was our turning point, if you will. And then the acquisition took us on a different path, but that was how we continued through thinking through it.
Wow, what a fun way and what kind of inspiration for the team, right?
Right.
How do you remember how many team members back then, 2018?
I think it was close to about 100 or just shy of 100, I believe. We
Oh,
took them all to Disney World.
so it was already very big, actually, right?
Yeah, and we could see the vision. I mean, we could see ahead that, we had a really robust company, excellent marketing, sales, an excellent sort of fulfillment arm, if you will, and our scientific staff who were delivering the services that were not really there, continuing not to be there in the industry for companies that needed them. And so I think we were hitting our stride, and we could see that vision. And I think that's one of the reasons that made us attractive for acquisition. It was that ability to have that and be present in the marketplace with the brand that we had established.
Mm, love it. I think our company will be 10 years in 2 years. Maybe I will take them to Disney too.
Great. I always wanted to, and we actually did it for the 10-year anniversary. So it was great.
And you have 4 kids, right? You can do the both in one shot.
Yeah, they were very happy about that. That's for sure.
Yeah, that's what like a dream place for the kids and for the adult.
Right.
So we're talking about, I think that's really like exciting. So I also believe there's probably a lot of the downtime. So what are some challenges you faced in leading the company?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of significant challenges. I mean, it's not easy being an entrepreneur. And I think, entrepreneurism is sort of put on a pedestal, if you will. And it seems like entrepreneurs never have any problems, but we're all human. We all have the same challenges as everyone. And having to manage and deal with multi-million-dollar companies is pretty stressful. And so that definitely affected, my health, my relationships and everything. And I think it was on me to try to find the place that made me happy to be able to lead the company to success. And so for me, it was leaning into exercise, running, tennis, running half marathons, and also just trying to budget time properly so that I wasn't so the business wasn't taking too much from myself and my family and my social life and all of that. And so it's a constant challenge. I'm actually writing a book right now about my experiences of the whole sort of role that I played in building companies. And so it's a very sort of difficult challenge to balance as an entrepreneur. And I see that because I work with a lot of entrepreneurs and I talk to a lot of them about the similar sort of experiences they have.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting to heard about you say how to balance the family and the work because that's as a woman, right? That's all the people ask the woman, female CEO, how do you balance it? I don't really hear so many people ask men, how do you balance work, family? So how did you balance work and family?
It was a good question. It was very
Okay,
difficult. Yeah.
right?
Just, when I could, obviously, to be able to be there. But I had a certain time of the day between 5 and 7 when I was available. And after kids went to bed, I'd work, till end of the evening as, trying to get things done. Um, but having those times also for myself in the morning to go for a run and then also coming in to the office in certain times, just establishing that expectation of what I would be able to give to the company, I learned to do over time. It was very much at the beginning of the company, it took so much of my energy that I needed to sort of rebalance my relationship with entrepreneurism in the company to really get to a point where I could actually succeed in leading the company as well.
Yeah, I know. Like you mentioned, when you started your firm, your youngest one was 4 months. So it's
Right?
kind of like this is your fifth baby, and grow together with name.
That's right. That's exactly right. Now he's 16. Yeah, but he was 4 months old at the time and 4 kids in the house. So it was a busy time. But again, it was an opportunity I just couldn't pass up. I needed to do it.
But that's I think great for the kids as well, right? They see the role model as you, how to build a company, how to fight, how to success, and they are part of them.
Yeah, I've heard them talk about wanting to be entrepreneurs, and I tell them the good and the bad about that, so they're definitely aware.
They probably don't need to go to MBA anything. They already learned it from you firsthand.
Right, but it's possible. Just learn on the job, basically.
Actually, when my baby born the first week, I hold her in my arm. Just had the final negotiation for my client for the whole week. Let's switch the gears like to the industry insights because you are
Yes.
such a you have the 350 company. I think biotech unfortunately is still kind of like in the downturn, and there's I hope it's like a lot of people talking about going up, and so actually I still have so many clients. They have more cash in hand than their valuation. So today, actually, you're going to talk about it under how to boost the company valuation by the clinical strategy and the drug development. So, what are the significant trends do you see shaping the clinical pharmacology and the pharmaceutical sectors?
Mhm. Yeah, I think this is a lot of what the presentation is about today, but I think just seeing, from my experience working with the companies I have, that, clinical pharmacology takes a little bit of a backseat to safety and efficacy. And I understand that. I mean, that's what people are trying to get to, but I think I'd like to try to change the sort of thoughts about that, and that clinical pharmacology actually can be a significant benefit to not only the valuation of the company, but helping them drive towards those safety and efficacy signals in perhaps a more successful way. And so I think the trends in the industry right now are really going towards, richer data sets, using modeling and simulation to make informed decisions. And I'll talk about this, but there's ways to, use the techniques of clinical pharmacology to help better plan future studies, to better understand data, and to better position interactions with the FDA, all of which mean you're going to have a better valuation negotiation position as for investors and partnering.
That's great. We cannot wait to get more the details from your presentation. So I will just ask the last question. What advice would you give to the aspiring leaders and entrepreneurs in this industry?
It's difficult to get to succeed. I mean, I think there's a lot of companies out there that are raising money. There's a lot of potential assets out there that are looking for development partners. And I think if you've got one that that it will continue to move forward in development. It's just a difficult time to sort of obviously raise money. But I would say, there's just as an entrepreneur experiences the roller coaster of emotions going through building a company, that happens across all companies, whether it's entrepreneurial or not. And I think navigating the low points is difficult, but there will be high points as well. And so just keep pushing forward.
Keep doing. Thank you, Jeff, for the great sharing and this almost 15 years. But from what you just sharing, actually, it is a long journey, but it's a very inspiration. Thank you. So I would like to invite you to give more the details about the topic, about our topic today. Thank you.
Okay, very good. I will pull up my presentation. Oh, I need to share. Hang on just a moment. Okay. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, it's great.
Okay, very good. All right, so boosting pharma evaluations using strategic, conform, and PK/PD methods. So, clinical pharmacology programs are needed in all drug programs, essentially. And I think, for marketing authorization, this includes small molecules and biologics, cellular therapeutics, even to some degree. And I think a lot of times in my experience, talking to companies, they think of clinical pharmacology as only done in phase 1, if you will. You do that, and then you move on to phase 2 and phase 3. And actually, just sort of a terminology sort of check here. I use clinical pharmacology in this presentation as sort of a broad brush, talking about pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics, population PK, modeling simulation, pharmacometrics are all sort of under this broad term. But really, clinical pharmacology, it spans all phases of drug development. It's not just phase one. And there's times when you do phase one studies based on data you might get in phase two or phase three, initiating other clinical pharmacology studies based on how the drug program is going. And so what I like to think about is sort of a full spectrum of potential use of clinical pharmacology tools across drug development. And really, this is for, the studies and the data essentially are helping improve chances for drug success. You're de-risking the asset to some degree by doing certain studies or collecting certain data, which leads to potential increased valuation negotiation positions. And so the question is, which studies are needed now versus later? If you're at a particular point in your development program, which studies may not be needed at all in terms of clinical pharmacology? And it's all really based on what I like to do when I was working with clients before is what is their exit strategy? What are they pushing towards? Do you have a pre-IND asset that you're looking to partner by phase two? Are you in phase one and you're looking to take it all the way to an NDA? Are you, at various levels of various stages of development, where are you trying to get to? And how can you either de-risk that path or increase the opportunity to get to that path? So that's the strategy I like to think about. And just as a background, clinical pharmacology is needed for every drug program to some degree. And if you look at the package insert, it's the reason why is about 25% of the package insert for drugs comes from ClinPharm. Mechanism of action, the PK, the PD, indications and usage. The dosage is a huge opportunity to sort of lean into PK, PD data to help justify the dose and in different populations as well. Drug-drug interaction relies on PK data heavily, how it's used in different populations, how it might be used in patient counseling, and then pharmacogenomics as well when appropriate. So there's quite a lot of information, and you may not be driving towards an NDA. You may be looking to divest before an NDA, but the partner who eventually acquires the asset or or investor will think about what the market look, what you'll get there, what sort of information will go into the package insert. And so this is all very relevant to consider. And so I like to talk about creating value inflection points using clinical pharmacology. And I'll give very specific examples here in a moment, but essentially just so we're clear on the terminology here is I think of it as a drug development data that increases the chance for successful approval of a drug while reducing the risk of continued development. Seems very logical as an inflection point. And so clinical pharmacology can essentially, increase the value by de-risking certain drug characteristics that might be known for the therapeutic class, or might be a compound-specific issue that might be questionable. There might be certain issues within the indication that you're studying that you might be able to de-risk by having clinical pharmacology data. We'll use it to inform clinical efficacy and safety trials for greater chance at success. And I'll give an example of where that happened in my presentation. And then, as I said, informing dose selection and justification is a large part about what we use PK/PD data for. And then even avoiding the need to conduct certain clinical studies. I'll give some great examples of how that can happen and save money in development and actually speed up development as well because of being able to avoid those studies. And again, this all sets up for a successful NDA, BLA, or even supporting your next interactions with regulatory authorities. Providing support for those interactions with investors or partners is really, what we can really drive towards with this type of data. So just as a background as well, some of the different types of ClinPharm studies that I might refer to, the single ascending or the multiple ascending dose. This could be your first time in human study. These are, multiple dose types of studies in typically healthy volunteers. A food effect study, the bioequivalence, bioavailability, the mass balance, or the ADME type studies, drug-drug interaction. There's PK in different disease states, so this is mostly in patients. There's some special population data that can be gathered from elderly or pediatric or hepatic and renal. And then specialty studies like a thorough QT study. So some of the examples as an overview that I'll talk about. So creating value inflection points. So I'll talk about how we can use PK/PD modeling and simulation to avoid certain clinical studies, solidifying the dose selection and justification, building the rich data sets that can be used for that model-informed decision-making, which is very powerful, de-risking drug-drug interactions. And I'll give an example there of how that almost went wrong for a company. Determining the food effect early in development, a very important aspect for oral drugs. And then at the end of the day, just having a robust clinical pharmacology plan. And I'll give examples of this, and I'll talk about some of the red flags as as I'm starting to get more into the investment community of what I would be looking at for an asset, and what I would say would be a red flag that them not having in their clin pharm program. So, great example of using PK/PD modeling to avoid doing a clinical study. Thorough QT studies. There are studies that look at heart conduction based on administration of an investigational drug. Pretty much every new chemical entity or NCE is going to require a thorough QT study. It's very expensive. It can be $3 to $4 million. It's usually a standalone study. It's usually conducted in parallel with late phase or early phase 3 studies. And the reason for that is you want to know that the drug is progressing far enough in development that you'll want to spend the money on the TQT study. But another aspect of this that I don't think many companies know about is a process called concentration QT analysis, which uses PK/PD modeling. And essentially, the CQT analysis is 1/10 of the cost, basically uses data from studies that are already planned in the clinical development program. You just have to build out the data set to be a little bit richer in your early phase 1 and phase 2 studies to be able to do this type of analysis. But essentially, you can answer the question on the QT interval earlier and for less money. So you're de-risking that question mark when you go into due diligence, which may lead to potential valuation position to be increased. And so this is a great example of how using ClinPharm can actually help companies advance farther and de-risk the asset sooner. So some common red flags that I might see if I'm looking at this from an investor perspective, if I'm looking at a company is, not considering enriching the phase 1, 2, or 3 data, the studies with ECGs matched with PK data. Adding in some more time points for collection of ECGs, making sure that they're actually, matched with PK is a really important part that I would look for that could inform a CQT analysis. And then also not considering metabolites in the QT analysis. It may not just be about the parent drug. It could be some active metabolites that also might affect the QT interval. So that's also sort of prospectively planning to make sure you've got these data sets to be able to run this analysis. So another example is of avoiding studies is for the hepatic and renal impairment studies. So this is very standard type of studies that are required for most types of drugs. There's guidance out there. There are very specific FDA guidance on how to design and conduct these studies, usually conducted as standalone clinical pharmacology studies in patients with hepatic or renal impairment. But there are options to use, again, modeling and simulation, PK/PD, to answer these questions. And it's either about enriching planned studies for patients with the varying degrees of either hepatic or renal impairment, or perhaps the patient population that's being studied already has those varying degrees of renal impairment. There's an example I can give of a client when I was consulting that had a patient population. They needed to answer the renal impairment question. We realized they had a patient population that they had been studying that already had varying degrees of renal impairment. So instead of being able to conduct a standalone study, which would have delayed their NDA, which would have cost more money, we were able to go back retrospectively and use the data they had already collected to answer the question. It was a little lucky. It would be better if we could prospectively plan that, but that is one option. There is some ways to do that. There are some ways to do that to answer this question using PK/PD data, which of course, again, could lead to better negotiation position for investors in partnering. So some common red flags or mistakes that I've seen in the past is just simply not following the FDA guidance documents. And the study design wasn't designed properly, or not thinking about adding in, early in development, how to do PK/PD modeling. To build the model for a particular drug, you're essentially crafting mathematical equations that explain the behavior of the drug. You've got to do that based on data that's been collected for that drug. And so building in data preclinically, phase 1, phase 2, helps define and refine the model that you can use to do the types of strategies I've been talking about, which is, the concentration QT and the renal and hepatic population PK modeling. There's also the possibility I've seen before of pushing off renal and hepatic to phase 4. You may not have to do it prior to an NDA submission. And again, also failing to account for metabolites is a red flag. So another aspect that I talked about before is solidifying dose selection and justification. The important part here is prospective dose justification, not retrospective. I did have many times as a consultant where we were trying to backfill sort of the justification for a dose selection that progressed into phase 2 or phase 3. And when you get to an NDA, when you get to interactions with the FDA, they're going to want to see the backup for the selection of the dose that you've selected for those safety and efficacy studies. And so it really starts prospectively, preclinically. There's a number of ways to do this, but one way is to do allometric scaling. So preclinically, we're looking at dosing in animals. How does that translate to humans? Having that sort of dose prediction to inform initial dose selection for your phase 1 SAD/MAD studies is important. But as you get into those early phase 1 studies, just having clear PK/PD profiles, and that may sound easy to do, but it's something that doesn't always happen. Or even having an unambiguous half-life. If you don't have the proper PK/PD profiles, your half-life may not be as well defined, and therefore you may not be dosing properly as you move into later stage studies. And also just understanding the drug a little bit more. Is there dose linearity or non-linearity? That's a huge topic that needs to be addressed before dose escalation into patients, because you need to know how the drug is going to behave. And then continuing to validate for the justification part. So we do the dose selection in the early phase, and the justification continues in phase 2 and phase 3. And these are using population PK methods across the different populations of patients enrolled. Again, all this is needed for NDA, BLA submission, early and often validation before proof of concept or pivotal studies really is an important thing that can help with these discussions with investors and increase the valuation of assets. And so this all comes back to really building rich data sets. And this is something that I've seen many times that aren't available for companies as they're pushing into late phase clinical studies. Having those rich data sets gives more opportunities to understand the drug, to use strategies like model-informed drug development. This is essentially almost like a crystal ball. You're able to use the model of the drug behavior to predict various scenarios for additional or future clinical studies. It's very powerful. Not many companies lean into it, if you will. So having that is a huge positive in my mind if I'm looking at a company to invest in. And that is it's a way to really understand and set up the program for success, which obviously we're talking about would increase the valuation of an asset. And then just using rich data sets is going to help with dose selection, justification. It's going to absolutely help with avoiding certain clinical pharmacology studies, as I've mentioned, in just overall improving the possibility of success for submission to the regulatory authorities, and then in discussions as well. So I've got a lot of red flags here. I'll go through these quickly, but essentially, these are some of the things that I would flag if I'm looking at an asset in due diligence. Is not, only considering the SAD or MAD data is necessary for the NDA BLA when there's so many other clin pharm studies that are needed. a limited number of dose levels evaluated for PK, not necessarily getting the human metabolite profiling done early enough to know if there's active metabolites. So you're not monitoring them in patient studies if you don't know about them. Thinking that you only can do healthy volunteer studies, or you only do healthy volunteer studies and no PK, PD data in patients or in phase 2 or phase 3. And then even just, not getting an accurate assessment of PK. And this is very common in oncology, where it's obviously very difficult to get, multiple PK sampling time points, but really trying to understand the PK in oncology indications is very important. And there's ways to do that. Failure to consider interim PK analysis between dose escalation cohorts, you're sort of validating the dose selection for the next cohort by understanding exposure levels. That's very important. Not having an adequate PK sampling schedule. And this gets back to, having a well-defined half-life. If the PK sampling schedule isn't done well, then the half-life isn't well known and dosing may not be as accurate as possible. Inadequate analysis of data, just incorrect interpretation, failure to get, urine PK early, or just not correlating PK and PD data well. And also just not testing a dose range, either not going high enough or low enough is something that can be an issue as well. So this is all speaks to addressing to get robust, rich data sets that help inform decisions to make better, selections for clinical studies as you move forward. And then for drug-drug interactions, so the story about this is essentially, as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, there was a company that went into phase 2, had an asset that was in an indication with a patient population that was taking a concomitant medication. That medication had an unknown drug-drug interaction with the investigational drug, which led to lower exposures of the investigational drug and a negative efficacy signal. So that it was unknown that there was a DDI. And so the drug could have failed. There was an investigation and looked into what happened, and the DDI was revealed. But that's why it's important to understand, what sort of drug-drug interactions are possible in the patient population that you're going to go into with your drug. And really, the key here is just knowing that there is a plan, a strategic plan, and being well-versed in, DDIs when you're talking to partners and investors can be very helpful. And it comes down to, again, prospective planning, starting preclinical, looking at the P450 and the transporter studies that will inform potential clinical DDIs. Then starting to get into the clinical studies and just having plans for how to address the DDIs that the agency, the FDA or the EMA, are going to want to see addressed in the NDA and the BLA. These are all sort of things that need to be addressed, whether it's a standalone study, maybe a combination of cocktails of interacting drugs in one study, or you might have a patient population that's a polypharmacy population, how to deal with that with model-based methods. So there's a lot of strategies here, and it all comes down to designing something very specific for each drug that's important early on and prospectively. So the other one is talk about food effect. And so for me, it's just, a red flag is not determining food effect early enough in a development program. I think we all know that food can increase or decrease drug exposure. And so it's important to address that early on in the SAD/MAD type studies. Typically, what I recommend in the past is a preliminary food effect study in the SAD or MAD phase 1 studies where there's an additional cohort that's added. And it really is just an early look. It's to de-risk the potential so that going into a phase 2 study whether you need to dose with food or not. Later on, after the phase 2 and phase 3 studies are showing positive results, then the definitive food effect study, which is more of a bioequivalence type of an study, would come into play for the NDA, and that's really just for the labeling in the package insert. So I'm just going to walk through, if I was to build something from scratch, how would I do an ideal clinical pharmacology program? What would it look like? And these are sort of the things I look for, if I'm looking at a due diligence for an asset, for an investment. So starting preclinical, I would look for biomarkers and pharmacodynamic response. In preclinical studies, there's TK, or what's called toxicokinetics. and then correlating that TK with the pharmacodynamic markers that are present preclinically, doing a non-clinical mass balance study to get an assessment of potential metabolites in animals, starting model development, starting to develop a model of how the drug works in animals, doing the transporter assays and the CYP assays for DDI information. DMPK is another field that I'm not going to go into, but that's an important part. And then the scaling, the dose scaling from animals to humans using allometric methods. Dose prediction, the BCS I'm not going to go into, but that's an important part as well. Just preparing for your pre-IND meeting and the IND. Having sort of that backup initially in animals. And then moving into phase 1, obviously there's a single and multiple dose study in most cases, correlating PK and PD together to have an initial dose justification, starting to develop the model using rich data from the SAD-MAD study for model development and considerations how that might impact the patient population, such as DDIs. Having an end of phase 1 meeting with the FDA. And so key investigations in phase 1, typically, and then this is going to vary, the first time in human, having a human metabolite ID. So then playing off the data from the non-clinical ADME study, doing the preliminary food effect, as I mentioned, having a human ADME full radio-labeled study, fairly close in phase 1 and maybe pushed to phase 2. Starting to evaluate the DDI potential before phase 2. Can you move into healthy patients versus can you move into healthy volunteers versus patients, or vice versa? Sometimes oncology drugs are able to be dosed in healthy volunteers, which might give you a richer data set and from a PK perspective. There's other things here, and considering the QT question as well, building in the rich ECD, ECG, and PK data early and often. And then moving into phase 2 is continuing this process and building on the data. So you've got, in phase 2, I would collect what I call rich and sparse sampling. Rich PK, PD sampling is for what we call sort of non-compartmental pharmacokinetics. The sparse sampling, more population methods, is for the pharmacometrics or population PK. So doing both of those types really enriches the data set that you've got. Continuing to build the dose justification, model refinement, using that for informed drug development decisions, and now starting to loop back to do other clin pharm studies. And I'll talk about that on the other side of this slide here in a second. Doing pediatric plans for your end of phase 2 meeting. But the key investigations here are now maybe doing some DDI studies, maybe doing the renal hepatic studies, or pushing that to phase 3. This is sort of the decision point around the exit. Do you want to de-risk the asset now, or do you want to push that off? And other things like the concentration QT as well. And then for phase 3, obviously the focus here is the pivotal efficacy studies, continuing to collect safety, but building out the PK/PD data set, more sparse sampling for the modeling, exercise, confirmation of dose justification, continuing the model-informed development, looking at different populations and how they might be impacted by the drug. And here again, feedback to start other studies. One of them, as I mentioned, was the definitive food effect. This is where, if the asset is doing well, I might go back and do the definitive food effect, preparing for that pre-NDA, BLA, FDA meeting. And so again, on the right side is, the studies that you might finish from a clin pharm perspective, the DDI, either that or pop PK or as a standalone, renal hepatic, thorough QT, and the other ones that I mentioned as well. Or pushing things off to post-marketing. Is there a strategy for hepatic and renal to be done post-approval? Absolute bioavailability is something that can be done, doesn't necessarily need to be done prior to NDA. And just other things like life cycle management. Can there be other indications that the model that was developed pre-approval could be used for? So what I like to think about is, this is I call it sort of a bootstrap Goldilocks feedback paradigm. So the program, in my mind, should be a reasonable but minimalistic, prospectively planned clinical pharmacology program. Builds on prior data, that's validated with FDA meetings, creates these value inflection points based on the exit strategy, loops back to initiate key investigations when appropriate, dovetails with other aspects and areas of the company, from non-clinical, manufacturing, and regulatory, It really is based on scientific, corporate, and investor expectations about what you need to do and what questions you need to answer. And just doing enough for marketing authorization and no more and no less. So it sort of looks like this, if I put it in a schematic, is you've got data that informs the next phases of development, and then you loop back and you initiate other ones as you continue along the process of getting the drug to approval to fill out the different sections of the marketing authorization, the NDA, and the BLA, creating those value inflection points. So the take home here is basically prospectively designing the clinical pharmacology program will improve valuation negotiations with potential partners and investors. As I mentioned, that basically spans the entire spectrum of drug development. It's not necessarily linear. It can loop back, as I mentioned, reduce overall development timelines and costs, create value inflection points. At the end of the day, it's all about the data and getting prospectively, planning prospectively for great data and great exits. You're on mute.
Thank you, Jeff, for the great sharing. I think Lexi is really like from the preclinical to the post-marketing actually play a very important role. How to make sure you can save money and the clinical trial and faster and make sure we get the important data and for the different purpose. So I got a question actually in the market was not so good like in the past few years was done. So we observed a lot of the company actually license out or the seeking for the sale their asset in the earlier stage. Normally before was like a phase 3, like a bigger pharma will acquire the phase 3, but now we see actually acquisition or like a early stage now. So could you please go, I know you already shared some of the like information, like a phase 1 or even phase 2. Could you please go more in details and what's your advice for these biotech companies that wanted to sell or wanted to license out their assets at the phase 1 or even like early phase 2?
Yeah, I would lean into heavily understanding how the drug behaves, and that really relies on getting the rich data sets like I talked about, is making clear that that they know what they're doing from a clinical pharmacology perspective. And it's very obvious looking at a program in due diligence if companies have run past PK to try to get to a proof of concept. So making sure they take the right steps. I've seen programs that are like the Cadillac programs of clinical pharmacology, and it's impressive to see. Not every company can do that, and so I think there are obviously budget limitations. You can't do everything you want to do. So I would say if I was a small company startup looking to sort of divest phase 1, phase 2, I would just be 100% focused on not only getting the safety data, but getting the correct PK data analyzed properly, doing the right studies to justify the dose that would go into the next study, basically. And I think that would be key. And also starting to think about model-informed development, because that's really important to help think about what the next study will look like. So those sort of strategies are going to come across well to potential partners and investors, I believe.
That's a very good suggestion. So you also mentioned, I think I find it very interesting DDI strategy.
Yeah.
For this, you especially mentioned for the will be very helpful if you do right, can actually facilitate the discussion with the investors. Could you please explore this topic more in depth?
Yeah. Yeah, the DDIs are a challenge because the typically when you move into patients, they're on multiple different medications, and so there's a standard sort of way to do it based on the preclinical data where you've got your P450 enzymes and your transporters and seeing if your investigational drug is impacted by or metabolized by those enzymes. Then there's moving into patients. Is there a particular medication that every patient is using that may not necessarily be part of those transporter or CYP pathways? And just having a rational strategy knowing what the FDA is probably going to want to look at, and that's validated with FDA meetings. So having a drug development or a DDI plan, validating it with FDA meetings, having that roadmap from the FDA and their agreement is very important to be able to address that, I think.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. So you also mentioned, I think it's probably from our work, we don't really access to that is a food effect
Yeah.
for data. And so food can impact on the safety and efficacy. From your presentation, I think you mentioned about like probably phase 3, like a food effect. But how about the early stage? What's your suggestion?
Yeah, no, that's what I was suggesting is early in phase 1 is getting a preliminary food effect assessment. The definitive one comes later, or you could do a definitive one early on, but it's more expensive to do that. And there's a less expensive way to understand if there is a food effect, and that's doing an additional cohort in the first in human SAD MAD type studies with the traditional sort of food effect design. That's a way to do it.
So actually, you should start early, but actually the indefinite way is on the phase 3. So make sure not the impact on the whole data.
Correct. So it's a two-step process. The first one is early, quick look. The second one is a definitive full study before approval that the FDA will want to see.
Okay. Because of the limited time, so actually we have to conclude the webinar interview with Jeff today. But if you have more questions or any like comments and want to reach out, Jeff, please email us, and so we will put you in contact. And we definitely want to continue this conversation. I think actually clinical trial, the drug development is the most money to invest in for the whole drug development process. So I think this is very valuable license you give to us. Thank you, Jeff.
Absolutely. Thank you.
And also congratulations again on your great success of building company and take exit.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I would love to have you back and to have more conversation here, like on the global level next time.
Very good. I would love to discuss that. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks
you.
everyone joining us today. And so we are looking forward to talk to you next time.